1,000-word chapter that has to be ruthlessly excised. But I'll start with 1955, when there was a series of articles in local newspapers in Taipei that asked, why are people in Taiwan still speaking Japanese? Despite repeated government decrees proscribing its use and an orchestrated campaign to promote Guoyu, by now it's a decade after the KMT takeover, many people were still speaking the language of the former colonial regime. In schools, government offices, factories, public spaces, spoken Japanese lingered as an uncomfortable reminder of the colonial past. So my paper tries to look at the process of linguistic change in Taiwan from 45 to 55. The birth of Guoyu on the mainland occurred during the early years of colonial rule. And at its conclusion, there were not that many people in Taiwan who had any familiarity with the concept of a Chinese national language. So when the KMT arrives, they are determined to eradicate, of course, the vestiges of Japanese imperialism. And so one of their first tasks is to supplant the imposter Kokugo and teach people to speak the national language that they believe is the true national language. So my research explores the frictions and vacillations in what turns out to be a triangular competition between the colonial language, a newly arrived Guoyu, and the island's varied vernacular speech. So due to the obvious time constraints, I will address only two components. The first is the effort to uproot Japan, and the second is to then implant China. So the government order prohibiting the use of Japanese in publications and schools was announced almost immediately after the KMT's arrival, but initially they postponed it for a year because they couldn't quite make it work. As is well known for people who grew up under Japanese rule and could only read Japanese, the publication ban effectively turned them into illiterates. With an energetic censorship regime, the publication ban could be implemented, and it was put into effect in October of 1946. The second part of the ban, which said no Japanese in education, proved more difficult to enforce. So there were numerous petitions from schools, which indicated that many were having trouble coping with this mandated change. It was clear that it was going to take more time for the transition because there was an acute teacher shortage and the education system itself was in disarray. And so if you didn't have teachers who could teach Guoyu, you can't really make people stop teaching using Japanese if you don't have something else to offer them, right? So after the February 28th incident in 47, the political voltage around this Japanese language was amplified. As one commentator wrote in an educational journal in June of that year, quote, the government has already ordered all schools to use the national language or Taiwan as the medium of instruction. But no matter where we go, whether in government agencies, schools, or encountering colleagues, students, or workers on the streets, we meet people whose mouths are full of Japanese. The strangest thing is that a small number of young people actually take pride in being able to speak Japanese. This is something that we must pay special attention to. If we do not get rid of the Japanese language completely, the national language will not be able to spread widely, and the venomous roots implanted by the Japanese for 51 years cannot be exterminated. So according to this commentator, there were still old bookshops that were full of Japanese publications, patronized by eager customers in open defiance of the ban. The underlying problem, according to this person, was rooted in the government's failure to clearly spell out the penalties for infractions and to enforce them rigorously. So these complaints about the lack of enforcement would persist for many years, as numerous directives then alluded to the uneven implementation of the ban. So in the summer of 48, there was a provincial decree that griped about shops that still featured Japanese writing in their window displays and advertisements. The following year, there was an irate memo from that chastised government workers and educational personnel who, quote, by and large still use Japanese to converse amongst themselves and to communicate with the public. At home, parents were teaching their children Japanese while, quote, despising to learn the national language. Even newly arrived Waishengren were trying to study the former colonial language. There was a widely circulated but largely toothless order in December of 49 that said, henceforth, the staff of government agencies in the entire province should avoid conversing in Japanese as much as possible. So it turns out speaking Japanese was a defective habit that people were either unwilling or unable to kick. Now, to this question of whether it was volition or ability, whether they were unwilling, unable, or both, there were hypotheses that abounded. So one hypothesis was that this was the insidious effect of Japanese language, and it had seeped so deeply into the collective consciousness to the extent that it could not be dislodged. So this fit with the slave mentality argument that a generation of KMT leaders had put forth. In addition, or instead, there was another hypothesis that speaking Japanese was a willful disregard for the government and its sinicization imperative. So was this a form of revolt against the government or an explicit rejection of the fatherland? Now, there were others who had another hypothesis that was a little more innocuous that said that this was an expedient, not really related to political resistance, because the difficulty of learning the Chinese script and the paucity of phonetically annotated materials. Quote, how can we blame Taiwanese people for continuing to prefer Japanese books, end quote. So addressing this issue, He Rong published a lengthy article in 1951. So he was a member of the National Language Committee and in charge of trying to make this work. And here he put forth detailed arguments for why Taiwan still should not use Japanese script and speech. Many people, He Rong wrote, were advocating for its reinstatement in publications, film, radio, on the grounds of utility for communication. So this is 51, and he's saying that there are people who want to bring back Japanese. They said, for instance, if English language newspapers can be published in communist China, why should Japanese ones be disallowed in Taipei? This utilitarian view, according to He Rong, disregarded the national Minzu character of language. At the same time, He actually interpreted this perspective as evidence that Taiwanese compatriots did not actually like the Japanese language. There's a lot of fear that people were embracing the Japanese language because they loved it for some reason. The attraction, he said, was rooted in curiosity or convenience. And the calls for reinstatement served instrumental purposes rather than proof of affection. He Rong conceded that the ban had turned many Taiwanese into illiterates, but why don't they welcome the obvious solution, the Zhuyin Fuhao, which promised a shortcut to learning the national language? So to conclude, he tried to turn the utilitarian argument on its head. Quote, many Taiwanese compatriots have already learned Japanese kana, and they say that it is more convenient. But don't we need to consider the origins of this kind of convenience? This convenience represents 50 years of bitter suffering on the part of our Taiwanese compatriots and the humiliation of the entire Chinese nation. So if it were truly advantageous, would one also posit that the Qing government should have ceded several more provinces to Japan in 1895 so that more people could have enjoyed this kind of convenience? So despite somewhat charged rhetoric, He Rong was actually trying to direct the discussion away from intentional ideological opposition and focus instead on what he saw as popular misunderstandings of the meaning and function of language. And if only people would truly understand what was going on, then they would change their ways. Now, other people were more suspicious and inclined to interpret the pervasive use of Japanese in overtly political terms. So there's lots of examples of this. In 51, the Railway Administration criticized its staff and workers, most of them local Taiwanese, for evincing indifferent and extremely unsympathetic attitudes towards the language and culture history of the mainland. High school students and university students were even more troublesome because they possessed the ability to speak Guoyu, but evidently willfully chose to use Japanese. Students were not the only guilty ones. Equally culpable were government workers who were repeatedly reprimanded and threatened with sanctions. Most egregious and disconcerting of all was the specter of locally elected officials who were unwilling or unable to break the habit. So according to a press report in 1956, the most open and pervasive atmosphere of speaking Japanese could be found in the local assemblies. And when different groups tried to sort of suggest that they use Guoyu instead. There were fights, attacks on colleagues. A newspaper article explained, they said that speaking Japanese was proper and in vogue, and to ban it from assembly meetings was against the law and human sentiment. If the people's representatives are like this, what can we expect from the masses? All right, I'm going to turn very quickly to the second part of the equation, which was to implant China. And here the question was how. As the discussion has illustrated, the linguistic change could not be accomplished by fiat alone. The government kept issuing orders, and the people seemed to keep ignoring them. And for those who were disinclined to regard the continuing use of Japanese in society as a form of political disloyalty, they had to find other explanations and solutions. And one obvious problem was that the Guoyu that was supposed to supplant Kokugo, the one that was imported to Taiwan in 1945, turned out to be a very sloppy standard. And there was a strong perception that many Waishengren from the mainland could hardly speak Guoyu themselves. So there were these persistent complaints about the erratic pronunciation of teachers from the mainland. We have instructors coming from Shanghai who spoke different forms of Jiangsu Guoyu. Others were teaching with Guangdong, Fujian, or Zhejiang variants. Some did not even bother with any pretense of following the national pronunciation, and they simply defaulted to using Shanghainese or other vernaculars. So in the early days of the KMT takeover, the confusion was understandable because you have all these people who are eager to learn, not enough teachers, and so if you have Southern Guanhua, good enough. Others slap new covers on textbooks written in Japanese and repurpose them for Guoyu. The average student at a loss naturally begins to wonder, how many variants does the Chinese national language actually have? And there's this impression that standard or not standard does not matter. There were, people felt baffled and asked, what kind of speech is the national language? Why do the teachers from Beijing, putatively speaking a standard, have different pronunciations? And why do mainlanders come to Taiwan to provoke the national language, yet some of their own cultural elites cannot speak it themselves or do not seem to have a concept of Guoyu at all? So in response to these kinds of pointed questions, the National Language Committee could only, quote, reluctantly tell our Taiwanese compatriots, with respect to speech, we need to be able to understand all the varieties of Guoyu, which is much the same with minor differences. They fall to the mainlanders who pay insufficient attention to the standard. Even with a 30-year head start, the provinces in the interior have made little progress. And so prevailing attitudes in Taiwan mocked both the message and the messengers, saying, it's your same set of Guoyu again. Whatever, pay no attention. It's just stuff concocted by a few people. And as a result, the national language, according to the National Language Committee, had at least 6 varieties, and the teachers all have different pronunciations. So in light of the cacophonous irregularities, at least what we should strive for is a least common denominator of mutual understanding. So to conclude then, in the long term, the National Language Committee in Taiwan pinned its hopes on developing a robust infrastructure for teacher training, 师范教育, and on institutions like the Mandarin Daily News, the Guoyu Yibao, which some of you might have grown up reading, or the Mandarin Experimental Primary School, Guoyu Shiyan Xiaoxue, which I attended when I was in kindergarten before my family moved. So I discussed these efforts in the book manuscript, and they start to bear fruit in the late 50s. Over the course of a decade of transition, Guoyu was elevated as the new prestige language and played an important role as one of the anchors of the political imaginary linking Taiwan to the mainland. At the same time, however, in local society, there were many cracks in the facade of linguistic unification. As one middle school student asked, quote, the principal speaks Japanese and the teachers use all kinds of dialects. What are the students supposed to do? End quote. So my time is up. Let me stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. It is hot. I just think we're melting. Yes.
It was helpful. Should I open?
Yeah. Otherwise, it just might be a puddle. A puddle of me.
You're
here.
melting.
Anyway, so I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Ting Hong Wong from the Institute of Sociology at Academia Sinica in Taiwan, who's going to give a paper on education and national colonialism, the case of private junior middle schools in post-war Taiwan. Ting Hong, the floor is yours. 15 minutes. I will show the science accordingly.
Okay. Hello. Good morning, everybody. I'm Ting Hong Wong. I'm working in Academia Sinica in Taiwan, and my research areas are sociology of education and education history. And this year, I am in Washington, D.C. For sabbatical. I'm spending a year there on a project researching American imperialism and Taiwan education after World War II, and under the sponsorship of the Fulbright Foundation. And I fly from DC to Seattle yesterday here. And it is too bad because the time difference between DC and here is only 3 hours. So if I do badly in this presentation, I cannot use that as an excuse. Yeah. And today I'm going to talk about the connection between colonialism and education in post-Second World War Taiwan in the period of 1950s and 1960s. And I will use Taiwan government's policy, private school policy at the level of junior secondary education as illustration. And because today I only have 15 minutes for presentation, my presentation can only be an outline, can only be very brief. But fortunately, my presentation today is based on a paper I already published 2 years ago in History of Education Quarterly. And if people are interested in my argument here, can read the article for more details. Okay. Oh my God. Okay. To begin with, I think I need to define what is colonialism and to explain to people in what sense Taiwan after World War II is under colonial rule. Okay, I will follow the definition of Jürgen Osterhemmel, who is a German historian, and define colonialism as a form of domination imposed by an invading minority on the indigenous majority. This is colonialism. And according to Osterhemmel, colonialism involves 2 dimensions of oppression, political oppression and cultural oppression. Under colonial rule, usually the indigenous majority has less power than the invading minority. And also under colonial rule, the culture and the language of the indigenous people will be devalued, will be treated as less valuable as the culture and language of the invaders. And so in this sense, I think Taiwan, the Kuomintang's rule in Taiwan after 1945 amounts to colonial rule, because at that time, political power is dominated by Waisenyan, by the invader, by people from outside. And the Bansenyan, the indigenous majority, have much less power. And also at that time, the indigenous languages and culture are being marginalized. For instance, Mandarin was made the official language of Taiwan, and Holo, the Taiwanese language, was marginalized, was banned in school. So in this sense, I would say Taiwan was under colonial rule after 1945 in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and at least part of the 1980s, at least up to the point when martial law was lifted. Okay, and and in order to sharpen my conceptual tool, in order to make colonialism a more powerful concept to analyze Taiwan, I would like to make a conceptual distinction. I would want to differentiate two types of colonialism. One is what I call the non-national colonialism, and another is what I call the national colonialism. I put non-national colonialism in the front because non-national colonialism is a more typical, more common form of colonial domination. Okay, and how to define non-national colonialism? Under non-national colonialism, the invader have no intention to assimilate the indigenous minority into the nation of the colonizer. And in other words, the colonizer have no plan to turn the colonial subject into the national, into full citizen, into their fellow countrymen, into their compatriots of the nation. This is what I call non-national colonialism. And there are many examples of non-national colonialism. For instance, the British rule in Hong Kong, in Singapore, and in many other Asian and African territories belong to non-national colonialism. I was born and grew up in Hong Kong. During the colonial period, the British have no plan to turn me and turn other Hong Kong people into full nationals of the United Kingdom. The passport we were holding is called Overseas National UK passport, different from national passport of the UK. Okay, then what is national colonialism? Under national colonialism, the colonizer have the plan to turn the colonial subject into full citizen, into their fellow countrymen, into the compatriots. And under this form of power relation, the relation between the colonizer and the colonized are very contradictory. They are hostile, they are antagonistic, but they are close at the same time. I can give you some example of national colonial rule. China in Tibet, the Han China are invaded from outside. They suppress the Tibetans politically and culturally. But at the same time, they recognize Tibetan, and they want the Tibetan to become full nationals of the People's Republic of China. And another example may be in the day of the Soviet Union, Moscow domination over the Republic are also the example. And also more related to my presentation today, Kuomintang's rule in post-Second World War Taiwan is also national colonialism. Because during that time, although 本省人 dominate the 外省人 dominate the 外省人, the Taiwanese are constitutionally speaking, they are the full nationals of the Republic of China. And the Kuomintang regime had worked very hard to transform the 本省人 into full nationals of the Republic of China. Okay, and these two types of colonialism has very important education implication. Under non-national colonialism, the colonizer are reluctant relatively speaking, reluctant to expand education. They are not interested in changing the colonial majority through school education. So usually they operate only a very small number of state schools to groom a very small number of elite as collaborators. And as a result of that, private school proliferate. The number of private schools become very big. And the colonizer usually follow a laissez-faire private school policy. They don't care private school. They don't care how this school are operated. They don't care their curriculum. They don't care what they teach, so far as they are not anti-colonial. But of course, if this school become anti-colonial, becomes subversive, the colonizer will take action to suppress them. But under national colonialism, the colonizer are very keen to change the colonial subject into full national. And as a result of that, the colonizer provide a lot of school, provide a lot of state school. And as a result of that, the number of private school is unlikely to be numerically predominant. And also under national colonialism, the colonizer usually would follow a very interventional private school policy. They would intervene private schools' curriculum, pedagogy, management, finance, in order to make sure that private schools are operated in ways serving the agenda of nation buildings. Okay, and because of time limitation, I have to be real quick. After the Second World War, the Kuomintang want to use school education to transform Taiwanese into full nationals. So they are very active in they provide a lot of public school, but at the same time, because of financial insufficiency, the Taiwan government in 1954 have a new policy, encourage private sector to run private school, and they simplify the procedure of setting up a private school, and they provide some financial funding support to private school. And as a result of this policy, the number of private schools grew from 1950 only 20 to 1959, 51, and 1967, 120, something like that. Yeah, but regardless of the policy of encouraging private school remain subordinate. First, they are never numerical predominant. In 1967, when Taiwan has totally 500 secondary schools, only about 100 were private schools. Second, the government required private school to follow exactly the curriculum of public school and use only textbook approved by the Ministry of Education. And because of this policy, curriculum and pedagogy of private school are unlikely to be different from state school, from public school. And also the government regulate the tuition rates. They allow private school to charge a modest amount of fees. So private schools are unlikely to be more resourceful than public school. And finally, the management of private school at that time was infiltrated by the colonial state. Yeah, give me more time to finish, otherwise the audience will blame you, okay? And I want to show two, I'm kidding you. I want to show use two tables to illustrate the infiltration of state power, the infiltration of the colonizer in the private sector of education at that time. But by using this table is from two samples of trustees of private school. One sample is from 1948, before Kuomintang moved to Taiwan. And another is from 1954 to 1956, when private school was encouraged. And you can see in 1948, the majority of the trustees of private school are Taiwanese answered. But a decade later, the situation reversed. The mainland became the majority. Okay, this is the last table. Okay, this table shows the occupation background of the trustee of private school Medical Center. In 1949, a lot of trustees are businessmen, medical doctor, a lawyer. They have their own business. They have their own clinic. They have their law firm. They have the material base to be independent from the state. But a decade later, this kind of businessman, medical doctor, lawyer, people who have the material base to be autonomous from the state, become very small. And also during this period, the number of politicians at the national and the provincial level, national politicians, local politicians, from military background, from civil servants, grew a lot. Yeah, from 20-some percent to 40%. So another remark I want to make. At that time, in 1949, people from religious background are from the Presbyterian Church. The Presbyterian Church is unfriendly to Kuomintang. But a decade later, people from religions are from Catholic Church, which is more friendly to the Kuomintang regime. Okay, I think I have to skip the conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So next speaker is Emily Hill from the Department of History at Queen's University in Canada, who's delivering a paper entitled Riceless Days, a Food Crisis in Urban Taiwan, 1953.
Yeah.
Emily, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nikki. It's great to be here. Like Janet, I haven't attended a conference since 2019. I was really looking forward to it, but the reality is a little startling. I'd like to thank the multiple sponsors and organizing teams who've made this possible, and I'm very happy to be part of it. Is my voice all right? So my talk. How do I move forward here? I'm pressing right here, right this one. Oh yeah, that makes sense. All right. My talk will be a topical overview of the project of which the paper I submitted is a part. I will also give highlights of the paper. So I'm interested in how a series of state agents, beginning with the Japanese, managed Taiwan's rice and developed it into an integrated monocultural system in the 1950s, by the 1950s. And this continued into the 1970s. In the 50s, sugar plantations were being converted to rice paddies because sugar didn't have good global demand at that point. There was a glut of supply in world markets, but rice was in demand, and it became very important in the planning of state agents. And in the Korean War period that my paper focuses on, these were Americans, many of them, numerous, big expansion of American personnel in Taiwan for those years, and Chinese, I'm calling them Chinese sometimes, but they're Kuomintang leaders. And I'm introducing the organizations and personnel involved in these two sides in this partnership, American-China Kuomintang partnership. And I'm interested in considering this rice production and distribution system as an organic machine inspired by a metaphor used by Richard Weiss, US environmental historian, who wrote a short, eloquent book on the Columbia River before and after its re-engineering, damming and so on, and production of electricity based on these dams over about a century. I look at rice cultivation in Taiwan as like the river, a powerful system of energy flows. Different scale. In fact, it's not just Taiwan, but you could consider global agriculture as it industrialized, or as it became an industrial sector in the world economy, as a system of energy flows, directed by humans, redesigned to a certain extent, but not fully, only partly. So the context of my paper and my project is that, especially during the Korean War years and continuing in the 50s, Taiwan's rice harvests were bountiful. impressive growth in rice production on the island, partly because of scaling back sugar production, but also largely based on massive increases of inputs, chemical fertilizers, largely supplied with American assistance. The U.S. assistance was key, both the fertilizers themselves and financing provided by the U.S. side. And the Americans and Chinese agreed on the usefulness, importance of expanding rice production. There had been rice shortages at the beginning of the return to free China, the Free Chinese administration. They're both very, very serious and about expanding rice production and proud of the results of their programs and their efforts. But they had different aims. And I'm interested in the tension between the two sides of the partnership. The Americans wanted financial stability. They wanted Taiwan to stand on its own feet financially on the basis of a stronger economy based on rice production, because rice could be exported in large amounts, as it was before the war, to Japan, which was a promising market. The Japanese were willing to buy Taiwanese rice. But the Guoyu side of the partnership didn't want to deploy the strain the same way. Military security was more important, especially in the later part of the war. A crisis, the Riceless days crisis, was in the first few months of 1953, after President Eisenhower, newly inaugurated, announced the deneutralization of the Taiwan Straits, February 2nd, 1953. And panic buying of rice resulted. The Seventh Fleet sailed away, and the U.S. had given no assurances of continuing to protect Taiwan, free China, after the Korean War ended. Then the PLA would invade. So the Chinese preferences, the Guoyu preferences, were to stockpile rice. So rice production expanded, but exports were minimal to modest throughout the 50s and beyond as well. This scheme never got off the ground. The scheme of recreating a rice basket for other parts of Asia in Taiwan did not bear fruit. It was not fulfilled. Did not succeed. So season after season, good harvests were projected on the basis of largely on the basis of how much fertilizer had been supplied to farmers in this rice fertilizer exchange system that the American side was very keen on. And an advisor brought from the agricultural school at Cornell University said, what the Japanese did is what the people are familiar with. We should recreate the collection systems that the Japanese imposed. And the terms of trade between rice and fertilizer were less advantageous to the farmers, let's say, than to the state agents who were collecting the grain, under the Japanese, under the Americans, under the Kuomintang leaders later. So exports kept not happening, despite projections of like 200,000 tons a year should be available for export. The amounts were instead very small. Japanese buyers were frustrated, disappointed, and turned their backs on Guoyu officials eventually. At the same time, despite harvest being good, rice shortages were occurring in the cities where the price of rice was controlled. So if the price of rice is controlled, there are police agents preventing you from selling at higher prices, then there's not going to be rice available. And riceless days were the answer to this problem. The American Kuomintang leadership promoted the consumption of sweet potatoes and wheat instead, at least once a week or once a day. Have a meal based on sweet potatoes instead. And I've read some discussion in which Kuomintang officials tactfully say that they don't understand Chinese tastes. By this time, rice had become, for sure, the staple food and much preferred. Military commanders, for instance, refused to ask their troops to eat sweet potatoes. They had to have their polished rice. Wheat perhaps was a little more palatable, and bakeries had already been established because wheat had been coming in for a few years by then. So first show you this quite illustrative but not complicated diagram I found in a JCRR file. Oh, I haven't identified them yet, but I'll get to them. So fertilizer supply plummeted and fell to almost zero by the end of the Pacific War because of disruption of supplies from Japan. And rice production declined as well. There were shortages, dislocations of the whole economy as a result. But things improved, and by around 1954, total rice production in Taiwan exceeded what it had been under the Japanese in the pre-war era. And you can see fertilizer supplies going up higher than rice production. Fertilizers were over-applied, rather misused, rather wastefully, because it seemed like that was such a good thing, this manufactured product, and pushed on the farmers. So I should introduce this JCRR, one of the agencies involved. It established in the mainland to prevent the spread of communism, somehow halt it or slow it down, but that didn't work. So it transferred its operations to Taipei in late 1949 and had an additional mission as well as the original one, which was to expand rice exports. And with the hope of doing this, American material assistance went largely to agriculture. 1/4 of the massive amounts of U.S. assistance, largely military, but 1/4 directed to agriculture, helped launch Taiwan's economic development as we know. The JCRR was led by Jiang Monlin, but I think he was rather a figurehead based on some documents, for instance, this one, prepared for him to sign. Don't know if he knew anything much about the details in the letter. It was prepared by a person who was not a public figure like Jiang was, but very important in the activities of the JCRR in managing the rice fertilizer exchange programs. Ralph Gleason in the Field, this is the actual title of the label of the photo in a JCRR report. A little fuzzy, I'm sorry. Gleason is standing with his hand proprietorially on the stack of bags of fertilizer, interviewing a farmer about his needs for fertilizer and how much he deserved. And the two colleagues of Gleason are standing there, and they look a little proud of their status. They're wearing watches and shoes, unlike the farmer. I like this photo for illustrating the relationship between the state agents and the farmers in the rice fertilizer exchange system. Another important person, very important as a public figure, and during the Korean War, a spokesman who was a mediator between the interests of the Americans and the Kuomintang. He was a Taiwanese-born official who had worked in the Liangxuji, the grain bureau under the Japanese, continued this work. He was Japanese educated, but he became trusted by the central leadership of the Kuomintang. He was doing a good job in making excuses for the low level of exports, not just, I shouldn't call them excuses, explaining in public why there was a rice shortage in the cities. It wasn't just 1 year, it happened several times. And here's a photo of the people in it are not identified in the news article that I found it in. A promotion of Riceless days by a group of officials eating spaghetti. And I find it really interesting that this, despite the reluctance of people to eat wheat and sweet potatoes at first, it's become a signature dish of Taiwanese cuisine, eaten in Edmonton as a very authentic dish. Looks yummy, actually. So I like this because the wheat has gone full circle from the Canadian prairies and the U.S. West to Taiwan and back again to Edmonton, Alberta. So grain had been brought, this wheat, extra wheat from the abundant supplies of Canada, the U.S., to provide relief to war-torn Asia and the rest of other war-torn regions of the world too. So here's a photo from the UNRWA archives showing the delivery of the millionth ton of wheat provided by this UN agency established actually before the war ended, before the United Nations was founded itself, because it was the United Nations fighting against Japan that it referred to. So it operated for 2 years, brought in lots of wheat to Taiwan as well as the mainland. So looking at the organic machine, I don't have much time for this, but I'm finding it inspiring to think of rice cultivation in Taiwan as an organic system. Agriculture is always organic, after all. Most of the work, most of the energy comes from nature. The water and soil are the other important elements. There's also a lot of human labor. And if you're intervening, redirecting some of these energy flows, you need human labor. Here we see rice being transplanted, paddy rice being transplanted. If you plant more rice, as farmers were doing in Taiwan, you have to transplant more rice. More labor is required. T.H. Shen, very important agricultural economist active in the 50s, made this observation. I have to look more for indications of this. Here's another example of human labor required to develop this energy system, the rice cultivation in Taiwan in the 50s. So this is still the 40s. Large fertilizer shipment coming in through unloaded at Keelung this time, not Shanghai this time. And so it took so much work unloading huge amount of fertilizer and putting it on rail cars to be sent all around Taiwan to distribute to farmers. So lastly, Taiwan didn't have to keep importing fertilizers. With US assistance, so the Americans made this industry a key priority for financial assistance. Taiwan expanded its small fertilizer manufacturing industry and celebrated this achievement, for instance, in a report on the achievements of the 1950s economic progress of free China, which took a painting and turned it into a design, cover design. A large chemical factory producing fertilizers adjacent to farm fields makes the farming scene more idyllic. That's the aesthetics of the day. So Taiwan looks more beautiful. Actually, this was supposed to be 2 slides, but they're showing it at the same time. Taiwan was embellished with the establishment of large chemical fertilizer producing facilities. I'll stop here, and thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Emily. Thank you.
Like every other paper in this session, mine is pretty long. If you're interested, please be patient and wait 2 years. It'll come out from the Wenshan Review in 2024. That's WENSHAN. Approximately 1 million nationalist mainland Chinese and their families under Chiang Kai-shek retreated to Taiwan in 1949, having lost China to the communists. Taiwan had recently emerged from Japanese colonization with a population mostly of Fujian, Guangdong, and Hakka descent, whose ancestors had migrated across the Taiwan Strait during the Ming and Qing dynasties, subduing the indigenous Austronesian peoples. The historical conundrum of Taiwan thus culminates in 1949, when nationalist soldiers arrived with their weapons and young families. Was this flood of military personnel and civilians and occupation force taking over control from the Japanese Empire and from southern China's settler colonizers of Aboriginal lands? Were they war refugees? Were they both, or something else altogether, awaiting half a century later their proper name? The conundrum of their historical identity crystallizes in my late mother's memory when she always reluctantly shares snatches, themselves stylized, from her saga of Taonan. The well-worn phrase of fleeing disaster, deployed by her generation of mainland Chinese to describe their escape from the Japanese first and then the Chinese communists in the 30s and 40s. Taonan is a lexicon seared in the Chinese consciousness because it recurs throughout millennia of dynastic history with endless wars, A young mother of a toddler whose second child perished months after birth for reasons unknown, she and my father jostled with the masses at a Guangzhou dock, trying to board any ship bound for Taiwan before the communist attack. I recall her frenzied eyes and hands and voice as though shaking still after all those years, when she described how the crowd fought on the gangplanks to the ship, many falling into the sea. In total despair, they suddenly spotted my father's Huangpu Military Academy classmate, Zhu Jingfeng, translated as Zhu Gold Peak, an army officer commanding his squad of Qiangbing, armed soldiers, literally gun soldiers. Zhu ordered his soldiers to commandeer a boat ferrying my parents and eldest brother to the far side of the ship for boarding. Without Zhu and his gunmen, I would not have been born, at least not in Taiwan. Had I been born and came of age in China to an ex-nationalist family during the Cultural Revolution, I would not be writing this in English as a foreign-born American academic. Every Lunar New Year when I was growing up in Taiwan, Zhu was our honored guest, since he stayed a bachelor for years, a factory foreman in the remote town of Tuchen, Dirt City, which suggested to a child's imagination how far he had fallen from his namesake tip-top to the ground. The child also came to see foreman as possibly the parents' euphemism for doorman. Throughout my childhood, I had difficulty deciphering his heavy accent, nor the patience to follow his slow, labored speech. How could Taiwanese-speaking workers on the factory floor understand their foreman's instructions? He lost all his pension and assets in a failed marriage to a young Taiwanese or indigenous wife, plus his jaw due to a botched surgery. So heavily bandaged was he one Lunar New Year that he could hardly speak. Our savior, Uncle Zhu, soon vanished. His gun soldiers, my affair even worse in Taiwan, had they made it across. Dubbed by Wu Zhuoliu as Orphan of Asia, Taiwan has long been a convenient way station for the Portuguese, Dutch, Spanish, British, Japanese, and even dynastic Chinese colonizers to stop and replenish, or even to resettle. Ever since the 16th century, Taiwan has been the foundling, fathered and abandoned by these foreign masters, the last one in 1949, claiming to be Taiwan's biological father. This essay focuses on novels and short stories, personal historical accounts, and films of that fraught moment when refugees, some with guns, fled to Taiwan for dear life, crushing other lives in their wake. Their settling in unsettled those who had already settled there, a karmic cycle entirely man-made. Specifically, I explored the shared literary and filmic motif of Laobing, old soldiers or nationalist veterans, in the plural or the singular, as pedophiles, perverts, and phantoms. Represented largely by second-generation Waishengren or Mainlander writers. Many of these old soldiers or veterans, armed no longer with guns, but fetishized as phantasmagoric phalluses, had relocated to Taiwan without much education and life skills, some of whom even drafted at gunpoints in China, the so-called snatched soldiers. One of the most wretched groups in post-war Taiwan without money and family, Laobing, sexual predators, displace the ambivalent subconsciousness of nationalist refugees with guns and that of their children, both of whom project their collective trauma and sin onto the scapegoat in their midst. Also transfer onto Laobing, precisely because of their disempowerment, is the Waishengren's awareness of their own increasing irrelevance to Taiwan or Taiwanese-centric politics and culture. So goes the historical irony of host/age, that's host and hostage. Like any foreign body multiplying itself in a host body, one becomes the host by taking hostage the natives and their land. The Ouroboros of time, in the form of rise and fall, death and rebirth, would eventually loop back, as it has for Weissenren, devouring that which used to devour. Although deemed strangers ill-adapted to the island, Laobing serendipitously embody Taiwan, the orphan ghost that come in handy as tropes, since it can be unhanded anon. Weissenren and Taiwanese writers do unto Laobing what China and the international community have done unto Taiwan. I'm going to skip quite a bit, and I've been using Antonia Chow, sociologist in Taiwan. Her realistic portrayal, her interviews of Laobing's lifelong dilemma, and that parallels literary representations of Laobing by Weissenren. These Weissenren writers mostly are second-generation Taiwanese writers of mainland Chinese descent. Many were born and raised in Taiwan, quite a few in Juancun, military dependence villages dotted across Taiwan to accommodate the flood of mainlanders. The moniker of Weissenren aims to distinguish the subjects from Bensenren, this province people. Weissenren, of course, meaning other foreign province people. Taiwanese residents, Bensenren meaning Taiwanese residents whose ancestors arrived from Fujian, Guangdong, and other mainland provinces long before 1949. Weissenren or second-generation writers coalesce around a re-envisioning of Laobing at the turn of a century as a collective root-searching to counteract, even if subconsciously, Bensenren or Taiwanese writers' home soil or nativist movement. As Bensenren formed their ethnic identity and took over governance through democratic elections, Weissenren, approximately 10% of the 23 million Taiwanese, felt compelled to claim their own heritage. In a modernizing, majority-rule Taiwan, the disappearance of obsolete housing project-style Juancun and other Weissenren symbols, most of all, the nationalist-dominated government, came to inspire second-generation writers to launch nostalgic backward glance. That the literary and artistic glance converges around Laobing as pedophiles, perverts, and phantoms is already foreshadowed by Antonio Chow's sociological treatises, unwittingly skirting all three P's to be read in Mandarin's fourth tone, P's, farts. In the plural, unseemly, malodorous, undesirable, yet recurring outbursts from the bottom, pun intended, of Taiwan's humanity. At a minimum, Laobing are symptomatic of Taiwan's digestive problems, a case of constipation, so to speak, after having consumed snatched soldiers and extracted their sweet youth. More broadly, Laobing stands as a clue to the endemic malaise of the Ghost Islands' traumatic history and culture. Given the fact that Laobing lived on largely through Weissenren writers and artists, i.e., children of refugees with guns, my openings projecting their collective trauma and sin onto the scapegoat ought to be revised as post-traumatic and original sin. After all, few of these chronicles of Laobing have experienced the cross-strait flight themselves, nor were they grown up enough to enact nationalist discriminatory policies to personify systematically sin against the Taiwanese population. Yet faced with the aging of the first-generation mainlanders, the dissipation of Juancun, and the erosion of their nationalist icons, they reconstruct the past through a race to the bottom, as it were. The abominable Laobing existence signals Weissenren's elegy for themselves, mourning the demise, yet paradoxically sounding the mea culpa for past sins. or transgressions against the deceased, as well as the living, against mainlanders, as well as Taiwanese. Although narrated oftentimes from the Laobing perspective and set in their lives, these Laobing stories have less to do with Laobing than with second-generation Weisenren writers themselves, less to do with Laobing memory than with Weisenren's perversion of post-memory, as Marion Hirsch defines it. I'm going to skip quite a bit and go to my first example, which I can't really show you on the screen, of course. Laobing as pedophiles. I basically give 3 examples to reduce it to 3 examples. The first one is Laobing as pedophiles, the second one as perverts, and the third one as phantom. Seminal to Laobing representation or misrepresentation, Zhu Tianxing's autobiographical essay, Thinking of My Juanchun Brothers, unfolds in a stop-and-go fashion for 23 pages, 3 of which are devoted to Lao X, OX, so named with an English letter in the Chinese original, a veteran from the Nationalist Army and an alleged pedophile. Guilty until proven innocent, Zhu condemns these Laobing codenamed OX, with anecdotal evidence. Undoubtedly, some of these old soldiers were unscrupulous or even malevolent. Bad apples exist in every corner of society. Yet to stigmatize all old soldiers in such a broad stroke betrays psychological scapegoating, which exercises Zhu and the second-generation Weisenren's own fear, guilt, and shame. The naming of OX joins the negativity of aging with a placeholder X for the unknown. Thus, for every single Laobing, Zhu's naming is name-calling. Laobing from China, languishing amongst the Taiwanese population, are xenophobically othered and anglicized in such a way that it denotes mystery in English. And I quote from Zhu Tianxing. They usually see OX and Xiaoling, of course, the little girl, Xiaoling, the victim of pedophiliac, doing strange things. Either he strips off Xiaoling's clothes and pants. Because of impotence or caution, these Lao X's won't go so far as to make Xiaoling bleed or to be found out by the mother at the evening bath. While listening to the story or playing Chinese chess, these boys who sort of peeping Tom saw this would be dazed, staring at OX's crotch, recalling his big cock. Without passing any judgment, they just feel, fuck, what a king of the beast. And the second example, Laobing as perverse, I use an example from Bai Xianyong's A Sea of Blood-Red Azaleas. And the last one, Laobing as phantoms, I use an example, just one screenshot from the 2019 horror film, ghost film, Detention. Thank you very much.
A bit of time, so I'd like to invite all of our speakers. Jimei, if you can stay online, that would be great. If we can move to the front, then that way Jimei can also see you. So I think our panel's until 12:30, and then we will move to lunch. So if we can use this opportunity to perhaps open to the floor, if they have any kind of questions or comments for our speakers. Nancy.
Hi, I have a question for Emily. I was wondering what kind of fertilizer? I mean, in Taiwan they used to use night soil. When did it become petrol-based? I'm assuming that's what that was.
Night soil was unimportant under the Japanese already. Case of intensive use of manufactured fertilizers. There are three types of chemical fertilizers, and you need to have them balanced, and they weren't always balanced.
So even the Japanese were selling them petroleum-based.
Oh yes, yes, yes. So I'm interested in the carbon and nitrogen and methane footprint of interested in too as part of this project. So the using too much fertilizer depletes the soils of its natural nutrients.
You use the microphone?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
With the fan going.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. The legislation in Taiwan to work toward restoring the soils that were depleted by
Excessive use of fertilizers for years. And I'm very interested in that. That too is also a component of the project. Thanks for the question.
Do we have any other questions? You could just introduce yourself to everyone, that would be great.
Yeah, Scott Pacey, University of Nottingham in the UK. This is a question for Professor Chen. Thank you for your paper. I remember being told many years ago by my landlord that when he moved across to Taiwan, there were these gangs of people who would basically test you to see if you could speak Japanese. And if you didn't, then they would beat you up. So I wonder, have you heard stories about like this in your research? Threat of violence as being a reason to not give up speaking Japanese?
Gangs of people who would beat you up if you could not speak Japanese.
Yeah, because it meant you were mainland.
No, I have not heard of this example. There are lots of examples of conflicts over language, but I have not heard that. That's actually really interesting. I'll have to check that out and add it into my 30,000 word manuscript.
Yep. Just introduce yourself.
My name is Guoyu from Academia Sinica. I have a quick question to Jenna. I understand why the KMT they use Guoyu for the language, the terminology in Taiwan. But why did the communists they choose to use the Putonghua, which means it's common language? What's the rationale for its choice of the terminology?
So the term Putonghua actually was used starting in the 30s primarily by left-wing intellectuals to critique Guoyu as the language of the elite bourgeoisie, and so Putonghua was meant to be a language of the masses. And so in 1949, the Communist Party adopts Putonghua and tries to make it into a socialist language, right? So it's not the language of the nation, it's the language of socialism. And so, but the content, like what the language actually was not all that different. And on the mainland, it produced this moment of confusion where all these people had learned Guoyu, and then all of a sudden they're being told to learn Putonghua, and they're wondering what's the difference between the two. And there are differences, but it's largely mutually intelligible. So it's an ideological project that wants to divorce language from the kind of the idea of the nation. And then, of course, there are these problems with, because there's Soviet linguistics that is very important as a model in the 50s, and it's a right? What do you do with languages like Uyghur or Tibetan, right? If you claim those territories as being part of your, sort of national territory, then how do you reimagine your linguistic policy to accommodate that? So this is a very, very long story. So that's like 50,000 words.
I have a question for Emily. Can I add a question? Yeah, and as far as I know, after World War II, the United States tried very hard to change the diets of Taiwan people. They want Taiwan people to eat bread instead of bantao, steamed bun. They want Taiwan people to eat noodle instead of rice. And I also learned that during the Second World War, the United States worked very hard to increase their capacity in agricultural production. And then the result is after the war, that the agriculture is a problem of overproduction. They have a lot of extra agricultural products.
In Taiwan.
The United States
In the United States.
produce more.
Yes.
Are the two related? Because they have produced too much. That's why they have to change diet of people in other countries in order to.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm interested in that. I don't know a lot about it yet, but I know that there was this extra grain, extra wheat, even in the 70s, 80s, into the 90s. It was being supplied to countries that were producing their own food, but it was provided at low cost or no cost to relieve famine, perhaps. And so there is a long history of this, and the moment of the supplies of wheat to substitute for rice and to I hope you can hear me back there, to relieve rice shortages. Just a small part of this story. So yeah, it's very interesting what you say about this. Mantou not being good enough. Made of, I'm not sure about that. Maybe we can talk about it later. Why mantou is made of wheat, isn't it?
Different type of wheat.
Oh.
The American want to promote bread as lunch in school. The rationale is you can eat bread cold, but you cannot eat mantou cold.
Oh, so did this happen in Hong Kong in the 40s as well?
No, the Hong Kong people, Cantonese don't
They
eat
didn't
mantou.
receive, they
Don't eat
didn't
mantou.
accept it. Right, they didn't accept it. Right. Thank you, thanks for your question.
That's great. Are there any kind of more questions in the room? I don't know. Do we have a live audience asking questions online? No. Somebody, oh, sorry.
This is Yes Wan from University of Washington. So thank you all for this great panel. And I have a more general question to all of you. So many of you made connection to your personal story and experience of the post-war era and maybe to your family members. So I'm just wondering, as like societies moves on, there will be the younger generation, they will have less and less of connection to this time period. And what do you see the future of study of the post-war era Taiwan, and how do you encourage and motivate students in the future to also delve into research in this area?
Can I
Yeah.
can I take this question, since I'm the one who actually have worked the personal into the scholarly? As you have heard, one does this at some risk to oneself, because usually scholarship is considered to be disinterested. You're not supposed to be work yourself into this subject. But I think all of us sort of take on Taiwan study to some extent because of personal reasons. We're from Taiwan, we're concerned about Taiwan, related to Taiwan in one way or another. And I have a very personal connection to writing this paper. This is not really my field. Taiwan studies is not really my field. But I feel personally connected to it because of the depiction of Laobing, veterans or old soldiers. And that, of course, goes all the way back to these kind of family stories I have been brought up with, which is this uncle of ours, which is, of course, not related by blood in any way. It's just the Chinese way of a term of respect. That Uncle Drew, who came to our home every year during New Year, and the story revolving around this particular old soldier, this Laobing. Okay, that's my take on it.
So I can answer this very briefly. So I was born in 1972 in Taipei, but my family immigrated to the US in 1980. And so I don't have an immediate experience of the post-war. I guess what I would say to students is that we tend to take a lot of the history of our families or of nations for granted, right? And this post-war period, I kind of stumbled into it accidentally. And I just realized that how little I personally knew about it. And so I guess what I would say to students is, let's not assume that we already know, right? If the history of post-war Taiwan was generally narrated in the United States as like, who lost China, right? And the failed Kuomintang retreat, and then the Korean War, and then the period that Emily is talking about in terms of the American and also Professor Huang's paper about the American imperialism in China, right? Some of that is really well known, but what was actually going on in Taiwanese society, I think, is really was really new to me. And so I would encourage students to sort of say, just don't imagine that you already know the general story, and so you can move on, right? That there are lots of interesting questions still to investigate.
And I echo you. Yeah, I think it is important to study history. This year, I study American imperialism and Taiwan education in the National Archive in College Park area. From the archive, I discovered a lot of very interesting story which I never heard. And I think that this story is, without knowing this story, without knowing this untold story, our understanding of the current situation of Taiwan would be very, 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 very limited. So yeah, I think for me I take for granted we have to understand history in order to understand the present.
Really interesting.
So I have a related question, kind of building on this point for Emily about land reform in Taiwan and how it relates to the story of agriculture and fertilizers. Because the thing that we say very quickly in class to our students is, and then the Kuomintang did land reform in Taiwan, and it was a success, and then all the attention is on land reform and its effects on the mainland, right? So how does that connect to the story that you're researching?
Thanks for the question. That's something I didn't have time to include, but I understand I did it because it's something an important argument I make in the project. And to generalize, governments like to take credit for reform of relations of production in agriculture and claim that their efforts cause improves abundant harvests, improve supplies of food for the populations. It's happened in other parts of the world. In Taiwan, the effect of the land reform has been hugely exaggerated, I think, because at the same time, though the results are difficult to distinguish, because at the same time, there was a large increase in fertilizer supplies and concerted efforts to get farmers to use them and use them properly, use them systematically, use the right amount, the right mixtures of them, and to and disguise the benefits to the state, to the benefit, the amounts that were being extracted, like the expropriation of the fruits of labor of the sounds Marxist, but the fruits of it is helpful to think in these terms, the fruits of the labor of the farmers. And so a similar thing happened in mainland China in the 80s. 改革开放 decollectivized farming. Wow. Gave people the incentive to produce more. At the same time, fertilizers are becoming much more abundant, much later than they did in Taiwan. And it was a priority of the state to import them. And it was a reason for reform and opening that the global chemical companies were pushing on the doors and their governments to reestablish ties with the mainland, because there was such a big demand for improved production of agricultural processes there. So I hope that answers the question.
It's fantastic. I think probably got time for just one more. Yeah.
I'm Yilin from Indiana University, and I have a question for Professor Ma. And I was wondering, have you considered a documentary by Chen Yaoqi, Liu Bijia, Chen Yaoqi, Richard Chen, who is a director who grew up in Taiwan and studied in the U.S. But he made a documentary about Laobing, and a lot of them were working in the East Coast and to build like highways and bridges and stuff like that. So I just want, because you talk about a lot of the literature about Laobing is more or less the post-memory of the authors of the second generation of Weisenren. And I thought that documentary is mostly about, it's a cinema verite style. It's about how one particular old soldier trying to cope with this foreign landscape for him. So I'm just wondering, have you thought about considering it, and how might it might be interesting to put it in juxtaposition with other literature about Laobing. Thank you.
Thank you for the suggestion. I think there are quite a few documentaries that would be relevant to the subject at hand. I didn't really go there because I was focusing on literary and filmic representations rather than documentary representations. For instance, there is a documentary on rock collecting, rock counting, along the, like you said, on the East Coast, Hualien, Taidong, and so forth. I think made by Qiu Guifeng or someone. So
is it Wu Tai Li? Is it?
Yeah, right, exactly.
That's a sequel to the documentary I mentioned.
Say that again?
That's a sequel to the documentary I mentioned.
Okay, yeah, so there's quite a few there. I've seen that one, not the one that you mentioned. But there's going to be issues involved. Being where I am in the Midwest, to launch this kind of research on Taiwan is pretty difficult. Actually, I contacted my friends in Taiwan in order to get primary materials to launch the whole project. In other words, Taiwan Studies seems to be everywhere, but it's really not in a lot of corners of the world. There's going to be practical obstacles to doing Taiwan Studies as much as you want. But like I said, I've been focusing on primarily on literature and film, rather than going to documentaries and other kind of stuff.
Okay, well, I think that brings us to kind of a conclusion. If we can give a nice big round of applause to our speakers.